Welcome back to Decode Healthcare with Harshal. If you hung out with us for Part 6, you know we covered the nitty-gritty of adjacent tissue transfers. Well, today we're taking things up a notch. We are jumping right into Part 7 of our Integumentary System series, and we're looking at complex flaps and pressure ulcers. Now, I know the CPT codes for these, like 15570 to 15738 for flaps and 15920 to 1599 for pressure ulcers, can look pretty intimidating at first glance. But don't stress. We're going to break this down into plain English. By the end of this explainer, you're going to know exactly what to look for. So let's just dive right in.
Here's our game plan for today. First, an intro to complex flaps. Then we'll look at the stages of a flap, and diving to muscle and deep tissue flaps. After that, we'll define pressure ulcers, talk about coding their closures, and finally wrap up all the guidelines.
All right, Section 1, Intro to Complex Flaps.
Let's start with flaps, which live between codes 15570 and 15738. Before we even touch the code book, we really need to understand what's actually happening in the operating room. So, what is a pedicle flap? In super simple terms, it's not just a piece of skin that gets completely chopped off and moved somewhere else. Nope. A pedicle flap stays firmly tethered to its healthy home base, which we call the donor site. It's literally like building a living bridge. One end covers the new wound, but the other end stays attached to the healthy tissue to keep the blood pumping. It absolutely needs that original blood supply to survive while it heals over the new spot.
Because of this whole living bridge concept, you've got to be super careful with the CPT guidelines. The very first rule you must validate is this: are we looking at where the flap comes from or where it's going? The guidelines explicitly tell us that the anatomic regions listed in the codes refer to the recipient area when a flap is finally attached to its new home. But if a tube is being formed for a later transfer, or if there's a delay prior to transfer, those regions refer to the donor site. You always have to ask yourself, are we dealing with the donor or the recipient today?
Which brings us to Section 2, the stages of a flap. Since pedicle flaps rely on that connected blood supply, they usually aren't a one-and-done surgery. They are actually coded in chronological stages, meaning you'll use different codes depending on where the flap is in its lifespan. Step 1 is the initial formation, like code 15570 for forming a pedicle on the trunk. Step 2 is the transfer, like code 15650, which covers moving that flap to a new spot. And finally, Step 3. Once the flap has fully healed over the new wound and grown its own blood supply, the surgeon cuts that original tether. We call this severing the flap, represented by codes like 15600. So remember, it's a journey, and you have to code the specific stage happening on that day.
Moving on to Section 3, muscle and deep tissue flaps.
Now, what happens when a surgeon needs to fix a massive defect where skin alone just won't cut it? Take a look at this incredible illustration on the screen. The surgeon isn't just moving surface skin, they're pulling deep tissues and muscles into the area. Notice how they carefully preserve those vital blood vessels and nerve branches? We're talking about highly complex reconstructive surgery here. The goal isn't just to cover a hole, it's to restore volume, function, and deep structural integrity.
To code these bad boys, we look at the 15734 to 15738 range. Unlike your basic skin flaps, these codes represent bringing in thick, deep muscle tissue to fill a major void. If the flap brings muscle and skin together, it's called myocutaneous. If it brings fascia and skin, it's fasciocutaneous. And they're categorized by anatomical site, so code 15734 is for the trunk and 15738 is for the lower extremity. When you're scanning that operative report, keep your eyes peeled for mentions of muscle or fascia being rotated into the defect.
All right, Section 4, defining pressure ulcers.
Now that you've got flaps down, you are completely ready to tackle one of their most common applications, repairing pressure ulcers. Often called bed sores or decubitus ulcers, these have their own dedicated CPT section from 15920 to 1599. And here is a massive rule of thumb. We absolutely do not code these using the standard excision rules we talked about in previous explainers. No. Instead, you have to look at the anatomical location, the depth, and the specific type of closure the surgeon used.
The second you see pressure ulcer in a report, zero in on the location. Identifying the location instantly narrows down your code choices. Is it coccygeal, right down at the tailbone? Sacral, at the base of the spine? Is it ischial, the lower pelvis you sit on, or trochanteric, over the hip bone? Each of these specific bony prominences has its own subfamily of codes.
Which leads right into Section 5, coding pressure ulcer closures.
Getting the location right puts you in the right neighborhood, but the closure technique determines the exact house you land on. If a surgeon excises a coccygeal ulcer and just stitches the edges together, which we call a primary suture, you're looking at code 1590-20. But if the defect is huge and they have to pull a massive flap over it to close it up, the code changes entirely to 1592. You really have to read the operative report all the way to the very end to see exactly how they closed the wound.
But wait, there's a huge curveball here. What happens if the ulcer is so deep that the surgeon actually has to chisel or cut away infected bone underneath it?
That bone removal is called an osteectomy, and it is a total game changer. When an osteectomy happens, the surgery is way more complex, and your code absolutely must reflect that. You'll be looking for codes that explicitly say, with osteectomy. For example, 15933 is a sacral excision with primary suture with osteectomy. If you skim the report and miss that bone removal, you're going to undercode the whole procedure, and we definitely don't want that.
Let's bring it all home with Section 6, wrapping up the guidelines.
We've covered some serious ground today. So to keep it all straight, I want you to burn this triple validation rule right into your brain. 1. Are you dealing with a donor site or a recipient site code? 2. What chronological stage of the flap is being done today? Formation, transfer, or severing? And 3. For pressure ulcers, did you confirm the location, the closure type, and whether or not they performed an ostectomy? If you validate these 3 things every single time, you'll navigate these 1500 series codes like an absolute pro.
In reconstructive coding, the details are literally everything. So crack open your CPT book, highlight terms like pedicle and ostectomy, and really get comfortable with them. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and join me next time for Part 8, where we'll completely demystify the coding rules for the local treatment of burns and the destruction of lesions. You definitely won't want to miss it. Until then, keep decoding!